The debate over Iraq continues. Welcome back to New Jersey Now. A much-awaited progress report on Iraqi benchmarks showed mixed progress. Only 8 of the 18 came back with a satisfactory rating. Jennifer Davis has more.
The message will be received.
The White House has sent Congress the interim report it mandated on conditions in Iraq. The results? Of 18 benchmarks set for the Iraqi government, it met 8 satisfactorily. Another 8 get an unsatisfactory grade, and 2 others have mixed results.
Those of us who believe the battle in Iraq can and must be won, satisfactory performance on several of the security benchmarks is a cause for optimism.
According to the report, conditions in Iraq remain complex and challenging. It claims Syria is sending as many as 80 suicide bombers a month to al-Qaeda in Iraq, and Iran is funding extremists. It also warned this summer we'll see increased fighting for U.S. and Iraqi forces there. But Bush urged lawmakers to hold off on a final opinion until a more complete report, with input from General David Petraeus in September.
When we start drawing down our forces in Iraq, it will be because our military commanders say the conditions on the ground are right, not because pollsters say it'll be good politics.
The report comes as both houses on Capitol Hill debate legislation to order U.S. troop withdrawals by next spring.
While we're waiting for the Republican senators to build up their political courage, the casualties are building up in Iraq.
Democrats say it's also time for the president to admit his plan has failed.
The war in Iraq is headed in a dangerous direction.
Polls show most Americans don't support this war. When asked about that, the president said, like any political figure, everyone wants to be loved. But he says he's making decisions based on principle, not politics. In Washington, Jennifer Davis, My 9 News.
And with me again, our Democratic strategist Leroy Jones, partner of 1868 Public Affairs, and Republican strategist George Ajjan, founder of Ajjan Associates. Thanks so much for staying with us, gentlemen.
Of course.
First quick question. There are 18 key benchmarks, as we mentioned, and of those 18, 8 received a satisfactory rating. President Bush still feels that we should stay the course. Why? I'll ask that question to you first.
Well, the president has, since he launched the plan to invade Iraq and started talking about this in 2002, has really staked his reputation on this, and it's unlike he's indicated nothing in his behavior that he intends to change his mind. What I find interesting is that that your colleague mentioned and the Democrats that spoke earlier, Senator Durbin and Senator Reid, the Republicans don't have the courage. Let's keep in mind, this is positioned as a Republican war, whereas the majority of Senate Democrats voted to authorize the war, and in fact close to half, 4 out of the 9 of New Jersey's congressional delegation also voted in support of this war. So, it's a bit of revising history at this point, from my point of view.
Let me just true it up and correct the record for George, because they were all misled. That's why they voted for the war.
Well, come on.
And, this has been, a failed policy, from day one. And the president, has not acquiesced to, just common sense and the fact that, troops need to be strategically deployed from Iraq. And, there is a plan, and there has been, resolution, that's been initiated to, start with troop withdrawal within 120 days. And ultimately moving through April of 2008
right.
For total troop withdrawal.
Well, let me just respond to that quickly. I'm somewhat unique in my party as someone who, from the beginning, was opposed to this war. I didn't think it was in America's vital interests. And from a constitutional perspective, I think Congress abdicated its responsibility, which the Constitution says Congress has the power to declare war. There was no declaration of war. And, this has been a trend in modern American history, but that's something that needs to be addressed.
Sounds like George agrees with me, right?
Well,
sounds like it.
but not necessarily. Look, as someone who traveled to Iraq, as you mentioned, I ran for Congress, 3 years ago,
right.
And saw the same issues then. It's very difficult to see American troops basically in a police mission in Iraqi cities where they don't speak the language, they don't necessarily understand the culture and the norms there, and it's a very difficult mission, and we're still having the same discussion, 3 and 4 years after the fact.
Well, the Iraqi government, excuse me, Mr. Jones, the Iraqi government feels like these benchmarks were set up for failure, were they?
Well, the whole war has been set up for failure, just from, its inception. When you look at the mere facts of it, the American people are, totally against the war. Majority of Congress is totally against the war. My colleague here, George, sounds like he's against the war. The only one that seems to be in favor of the war is the president and his key administrators who have a responsibility, for the operation in Iraq. Mm-hmm. We need to just look at the facts of the entire situation. $10 billion a month is spent on this war. That's the American people funding that. 3,600 lives have already been lost in Iraq. It's time for the president to get it, and it's time for him to acquiesce to the wishes of Congress.
But how much blame should fall on the Iraqi government? Do you both think?
Look, it's a situation in which we continue to stay there, and we have allies in the Iraqi government that insist that we need to stay, and it's not clear exactly what's being accomplished. Is it a police mission? Is it a mission to tackle potential terrorists who are targeting the Iraqi government and targeting civilians, which is clearly ongoing? But it doesn't seem clear to me, and the whole idea of the surge to send 20,000 or 30,000 more troops to pacify the entire nation, I think, is unrealistic. But to get back to the point you made earlier, it's not that Congress, where has Congress been? Congress in both parties, and particularly in the Democrats, who, as I said, a majority of the Senate Democrats voted to authorize this war. Now they're coming back 4 years later and saying, well, we were misled, or, that's a cheap excuse, and they're the representatives of the American people. Now, they should have demonstrated more leadership.
It's not an excuse, it's a reality. Even Colin Powell had represented, that there were some falsehoods with respect to, the whole logic behind why we were in Iraq.
Which is exactly why Congress needs to insist upon declarations of war before we send troops into battle of this magnitude.
I totally agree with you.
But now we're at a point, George,
where
with that.
$10 billion a month, 3,600 lives have been lost. Those people are not coming back. Those families are going to be in mourning for the rest of their lives because this president signed on to a doomed mission from the start. Well, we have a responsibility as elected leaders and those that that elect leaders to make sure that they do what's best in the interest of Americans, and that hasn't been the case with this.
But I feel like you're doing what so many do in this climate, is playing politics with the war. War should never be a Republican or a Democrat issue. It shouldn't be a Republican war and the Democrats oppose it. Let's not forget that in the 90s, when Clinton was waging war in Bosnia and other places in southeastern Europe, it was the majority in Democrats in Congress who were supporting that. The Republicans are going against that. Right. War should never be a partisan issue. And if we're going to send troops into battle on a large scale, that there should be a declaration of war. When we declare war, that's going to force Congress to really evaluate all the evidence, which they didn't do. They just jumped on board with this authorization to send troops into battle, and that wasn't sufficient.
And I agree with the latter part of that, but the fact remains, and I'm going to say this again because it resonates with every American.
You can say it quickly, please.
$10 billion a month. 3,600 lives have lost. It's time to leave Iraq.
Okay, Mr. Jones, Mr. Ajjan, thanks so much again for joining us today.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Next, a look back at the Newark riots of 1967. Where has the city come 40 years later, and where is it headed as we look toward the future when New Jersey Now continues? Stay tuned.